Welcome to Independently Speaking, the new podcast of the Independent Schools Association. Celebrating our diversity, we take pride in representing a broad spectrum of educational settings, including nursery, preparatory, senior, sixth form, and boarding schools. This vibrant network includes institutions specializing in the arts, sports, and faith-based education, along with those offering exceptional assistance for students with special educational needs or disabilities. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Independently Speaking. Now here is your host, ISA Director of Education and Inclusion, Helen Stanton-Tonner.
Hello and welcome once again to Independently Speaking. I'm Helen Stanton-Tonner, your host, and I am delighted you've joined us for another episode in our series on mental health and well-being in independent schools. As educators, you are at the forefront of shaping young minds and futures. Today, as we delve further into this critical topic, we'll discuss the positive impact of research-based approaches, the role of parents, and further explore the integrating mental health education into the curriculum and creating safe spaces for open dialogue. Whether you're addressing these challenges or enhancing your existing support systems, this series of discussions promises valuable insights and practical strategies. Together, we can make a meaningful impact on the mental health and well-being of the students and staff in our care. Now, joining me today to discuss the impact of social media and technology on student mental health and the role that parents have alongside schools in supporting their children is Dr. Kathy Weston. She is one of the nation's experts on parental engagement in children's lives and learning. She's a parent herself of teen boys. She holds a law degree, a master's, and a doctorate in criminology from the University of Cambridge. And she's also co-authored 2 books on engaging parents, both published by Bloomsbury, one in 2018 and one in 2020. Kathy is a sought-after speaker in schools and the founder of Tooled Up Education. This is a digital subscription service for school communities, and it's designed to really empower both the parent and the educator in a holistic access to evidence-based resources on all aspects of parenting, family life, and education. It's my pleasure to welcome you as a guest on the ISA podcast today, Kathy.
Thank you.
Now, Tooled Up Education has built an incredible reputation for supporting school communities and parents through the use of well-researched quality resources, some actionable strategies over quite a wide variety of topics. Now, to be the founder, you must have seen a need from parents and educators on this. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you do and why you think there's an increased call for evidence-based practices?
Yes, thank you. So I think particularly post-pandemic, I think the relationship between home and school has undergone requires a little bit of recalibration. And I think it was all a bit topsy-turvy during the pandemic. So suddenly parents stepped into teacher role, everything seemed to be a little bit out of sync. And I think I've always held the belief that children thrive when we work in partnership with parents as educators. And I think now we're in a sort of a situation where there's an opportunity to bring parents with us and to really focus on parent partnership as a vehicle for really optimizing children's opportunities to thrive. And we know in parenting, people often say, there's no instruction manual, but we always say there is, and that is the research evidence. So we operate as a sort of a space between home and school as that kind of research arm that's attached to the whole school community. And we really, try and, provide that research office, if you like, metaphorically, in every setting and in every home. So that if educators and parents are all leaning in to the same research evidence, well, children do have optimal opportunities there to benefit from that knowledge and expertise and the application of evidence-based approaches. And evidence-based approaches are derived from research insights. So ToolUp is a research organisation, and our job is to operate a little bit like a lighthouse in this research seas. We are scanning the skies, scanning the research seas, and looking for material insights, actionable ideas that the educator and parent can implement together in partnership.
And you must have seen a lot more of a recurring theme to do with mental health and well-being, particularly sort of since the pandemic. But there seem to be slightly differing views now about the impact of social media and technology on student well-being and the well-being of younger children, in that the sort of original positive attributes seem to now be overshadowed by negativity and possible negative impact on the mental health of our young people. Is that something which you've found?
So I think it's important to differentiate between different age groups. Children under the age of 12, I would argue, and research would argue, they don't necessarily need access to smartphones. And the reasons for that are a little bit less to do with the smartphone and more about what they should be doing, that can, ideas that can promote their general development. So access to play, access to outdoor time, access to adventure, access to books, all of those lovely things we want to amplify in that particular stage of childhood. And as you know, social media is designed for children, meant to be, the arbitrary line is for children over the age of 13. So I think that we know that, particularly post-pandemic, a raft of mental health conditions have sort of surfaced and bubbled, particularly more than others. And some of those, the explosion of some of those conditions coincided with the reopening of senior schools. So we saw an explosion of disordered eating, eating disorders that coincided with the opening of senior schools when lockdown finished. We've also seen rises in things like anxiety tics. We've seen rises in sexual exploitation online. All sorts of things are going on. And schools are thinking about, where has this come from? I think that there has been a great tendency to blame the smartphone. But as researchers, we would just pause on that for a moment and consider that we need to think about, in a little bit more granular detail, what we're talking about there and how it might impact on different age groups. So as researchers, we certainly don't think that children under the age of 12 should be, A, on a smartphone particularly, and B, definitely not on social media. But the reasons for that are not just to do with mental health concerns. It's to do with safeguarding, it's to do with sexual exploitation, and of course there are ways to mitigate many of those digital risks and harms through our parenting. So the thing is, at the moment, social media and smartphones have become the raw enemy of everyone. And unfortunately, that has been fueled by one particular publication that has gone viral. The anxious generation, and the sort of hypothesis that, or proposition that Jonathan Haidt puts forward, is that smartphones, social media have caused that sort of global mental health adolescent crisis. But as researchers, we would dispute that.
Right.
So I think that there are sweeping, attractive generalizations out there that don't really hold water when you look into it. So we can't blame all mental health conditions, certainly post a global pandemic or, global financial crisis, or in contexts where, many inequalities exist in society on the smartphone. That does not mean there are not problems within social media. Of course, that's not true. So there are granular things we need to worry about within the world of social media that we've kind of forgotten about and aren't really getting the attention that they deserve. So, for example, we know that appearance-based social media is particularly problematic for young people. And it's particularly problematic for vulnerable, psychologically vulnerable young people. So the sweeping assertion that all smartphones, all social media are causing the mental health crisis is not correct. And if you literally Google some of those, viewpoints, some of the most eminent researchers in Britain and in America are disputing many of the kind of the sweeping claims made in that book. And those are public debates that you can read and engage with. But within that, we're losing sight of some really important aspects of, as you mentioned earlier, there are still enormous benefits, certainly to older teenagers engaging with social media, which aren't popular. So things like driving their creativity, connecting with others. I was in Rome recently with my 17-year-old, and he was using his latest iPhone to scan in on ancient monuments so that he could read the inscriptions. He made a photo diary. He shared his experiences with his grandparents on FaceTime. So you get the picture that social media is not all bad. And I think that we've lost sight of the fact that there are particular populations of teenagers that might struggle a little bit more than others, and that can be disproportionate. So we need to be sensible in our approach, and most researchers would never advocate blanket bans or blanket approaches when there's so much nuance to this particular topic.
Yeah, and you're right, it's to get that balance, isn't it? And actually not to just rely possibly on the most prominent source of information that's in the media, to actually sort of look behind that. And I think that's where some of this evidence-based research that you do is very valuable. And sort of moving on from that, with the positive relationships, developing those healthy relationships with the platforms and technologies that the young people use. How can schools help that? How do schools support that sort of digital citizenship or responsible online behaviour while still understanding the safety that's needed?
So I think, first of all, it's really, really important that we all remember it is parents who buy children smartphones, not schools. And it's important that schools don't end up parenting, right, or doing the parenting, because that's not their function in society. So when I buy my child a phone, I think, first of all, schools, need to, set their own policies in relation to phone use in their own settings. But increasingly, parents have the expectation that schools will create rules even around home use of mobile phones. And I don't think that's right or fair. So I think that in school settings, some young people may not have phones, some may have phones, but in general terms, the things that schools should be focusing on are in particular around digital hygiene. That's a very important concept. And these are not things that are approaches that these are approaches that have to be shared with parents. We need parents to be doing that heavy lifting in the home setting. It's not just a job for teachers. So a focus on digital hygiene is very, very important, making sure that all young people understand some of the digital risks and harms, and making sure that in particular, we as parents we're the ones who buy them the smartphone, that we understand what our children are doing online. Which apps are they using? What are they enjoying about them? We pay for those smartphones as parents. We need to take an active interest in order to support the school in terms of what our children are doing and watching and reading. How are they responding to that digital diet? And that's another great term, the digital diet. So we've got digital hygiene. Now, as part of that digital hygiene package, it's not enough to have the online safety lesson. It really isn't. In fact, I don't even like that term. This is about digital discernment, digital hygiene, but it's also about empowering the parent to make sure that that child, no matter what age they are comfortable telling you when something has gone wrong, because it will. And, that's where that partnership, parents not just expecting the school to do an online safety lesson and everything's going to be fine. It doesn't work like that. We need consistency from parents. We need support of the school from parents and vice versa. And I think the sort of the third incredibly important aspect, which has kind of been missed, is the concept of curation. We need pupils to curate their to be taught the art of curation, making sure that whatever is in their feed, whatever's on their laptop or phone, makes them feel good about themselves and doesn't have the opposite effect. And again, that concept of digital curation is something that needs to be applied within family life as well. So it's not just about a pupil attending a lesson. These are entire approaches that have to be holistically applied at home and at school, whilst acknowledging many children will be much more digitally resilient than others. So the children who are psychologically vulnerable, children who are socially excluded, children who may feel a little bit more isolated in the real world, those are all of the children that schools should pay particular attention to when it comes to their engagement with the digital world. So there's a lot of things we can really focus on, but not in isolation. You know, I'm passionate about the idea that schools and families work together, because within that dynamic, that is where children will be safest. And we know, and people always forget this isn't a good headline. Children are safest in an environment or a culture where there is transparency, warmth, parental warmth, and dialogue is the biggest mitigating factor of all. So rather than banning everything or removing things, upskilling your child within the context of a warm dialogue and support is an optimal way forward. Now, it's up to parents when they decide to give their child a mobile phone, not schools. So we have a lot more power and control than we imagined as parents. And I think we need to get back to that and to remember we know from research what works, what doesn't, and what will ultimately keep that child safe. And in fact, there was a very fresh study quite recently saying that one of the most important aspects of whether or not a child can navigate the digital world well is the extent of family support. So family support is where we should be focusing our attention, and that partnership between home and school, and making sure schools do not take the burden of the entirety of that online safety concept.
And that curation that you were talking about, is that where you feel it would help the young people develop those healthy coping mechanisms when they come across negative experiences online?
That's right. So the great researcher in Australia called Professor Tracy Wade, and she has looked at the relationship between things like social media, Instagram, on body image dissatisfaction. We know that teasing, weight teasing in particular, those are some of the predictors of things like disordered eating. So whatever they're watching online, how is it, if it's making them feel down about themselves, if it's making them question who they are in the world, if it's driving social comparison, those are not good things for anyone's mental health or well-being. So that idea of curation is something that young people can really understand and work with. It's something we can model even with primary age children who don't even have a phone. We as adults can model that. We can curate our own feeds. And it's very empowering, isn't it? To think I can mute, I can unsubscribe, I can unfollow, I can archive something, I can mute it, all for my own protection and benefit. So that's giving children, young people, agency rather than just sort of, finger wagging at them, that we really need to exercise that concept. And the other red flag within social media, certainly at the moment, would be algorithms driving children towards particularly toxic content. So, for example, very extreme misogynistic content on platforms like Instagram again, or other areas. There's a million social media apps, but making sure that we are caring about how that content is shaping our children's thinking. Now, young people come across content in games, they come across it through dialogue, they come across it through social media. What is the one thing we can focus on as teachers and parents? Is their thinking, is listening to them, is challenging their thinking. It's injecting conversations with a level of cognitive flexibility, questioning things, challenging things. That is where our children are sort of optimally placed around that dinner table, chatting to us, around those classroom discussions. It is within the dialogue that they are safest. And I think it's very important to remember that just taking something away from them will not enhance their thinking. It won't upskill them. Back to that concept of what you described as the digital citizen. A digital citizen, how are they going to behave online? How are they going to treat other people? How are they talking to other people online? How is that material reflective of their own values or not? So, it's an exciting, I like the idea of empowering them to think about who they are in the digital world, because they're going to be in it for the rest of their lives, right? They're going to have a smartphone probably for 70 years of their life. So they need to, have the skills to manage that.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how you sort of talked about sort of parents not realizing the power that actually they have in that, the development of their own children. But a shift seems to have happened with the expectations of schools to have evidence beyond just supporting a student's academics, but start monitoring their mental health, monitoring their emotions, monitoring their well-being. And this is an area that possibly parents have thought, okay, the school's doing that, so I can actually release the reins. But schools have a lot of pitfalls when they do this, because there's an awful lot that they can fall foul of. Have you any sort of advice you could give schools in this area?
Yeah, so I think it's important for all of us to remember that family mental health, parental mental health is highly correlated with children's mental health. So by caring about how parents are feeling and doing as a school at that point of entry, identifying anxious parents, putting on support, workshops or anything that can help that parent feel part of the community, that's a good investment in pupil mental health. But also, I think, monitoring pupil mental health and well-being is slightly more challenging than you might imagine. And we need the responsibility of pupil mental health diffused between home and school. And that means really effective communication. And sometimes there can be parental reluctance or worries about actually disclosing when something has happened in family life. So that's problematic. I think we need to work on rapport and trust with parents, but also make it clear what we will do as a school community. Where are the pathways to support for that pupil? What do they look like? What will happen to you as a family if you tell us that? So I think that there's a lot of trust that needs to be cultivated between home and school. And monitoring mental health, well, one of the things that we forget about, fancy systems are no replacement for relationships. We know that the quality of relationship between teachers and pupil is a protective asset, a really important one. And if a child is experiencing adverse parenting at home, that attachment to that teacher becomes even more important. So, in a way, let's get back to basics and focus on the quality of relationships with the children in our care. And that means attuning, noticing, observing, having those soft conversations in the corridor or on the school bus or whatever, and just paying attention and caring about that young person. School culture, according to some psychiatric epidemiologists, will account for between 30 and 50% of pupil mental health outcomes. So think about your school culture. Is this a place, and you can ask pupils, is this a place where I'm comfortable going to the head of pastoral care? And pupils will tell you whether that is true or not. Is this a place where I feel comfortable saying I'm having a bad day or I'm upset? Is this a place where I will be punished rather than supported for feeling highly anxious about stepping into the classroom? So I think we need to keep our eye on the prize, which is that culture within the school. And, I think that is hard to measure, but it's not impossible to feel. And I think that pupils can play a really important role in helping the school think about the quality of relationships that exist within that system. And I would urge against things like non-evidence-based ideas. I'm not going to mention too many of them that are a waste of money and time when you could be investing in teacher well-being, in that rapport building between teacher and pupil, so that certain exercises or things that people might think are a good idea, they're no substitute for that substantial investment in people.
And with the rapport between the teacher and the student, what do you think are some of the barriers that get in the way of that? Because the leadership team could be trying very hard to develop the culture of the school, and they could be working with all their staff, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think my own feeling about it is that the staff should have permission to really be themselves. And it is about belonging. Staff need to feel heard and listened to, and, their feelings taken into account, and be able to be themselves in the school environment. And I don't think that clashes too much with being a professional. So I'm very interested in that whole concept of how you can be yourself as a teacher, but also be that consummate professional. And I think children will always warm to someone who's authentic and reasonable and democratic. Though we know that from research by developmental psychologists, that it is true pupils like to feel liked, heard, and some of those softer skills that teachers have, pupils really appreciate them. And if they feel that is someone who's a good guy, or someone they can go and speak to, that the teacher gets them, you are contributing to a culture where young people feel safer. So it is about belonging, and that's not just for the pupils. Belonging is a protective asset. So how do your staff feel? If I was a school leader, I would be turning over stones a lot and saying, look, how are you feeling? How are you doing? What could we do better? And I think people always appreciate being asked, and feel valued as a result.
Thank you. And that's a really good, insightful piece of advice. I think that's really amazing. Thank you very much for sharing that. As we draw this conversation to a close, if you were to give 3 pieces of advice, and I know there's a lot more out there than 3, but if you were to give 3 key pieces of advice to a school community on how the school and the parents could really work together to make that supportive, nurturing environment for the children and young people in their care, what would those pieces of advice be?
I think, first of all, you need to audit how parents are feeling at the point of transition. I think transition is a pivotal moment on that school journey. It's your biggest opportunity to get to know the families in your care. Who are they? What do they care about? What are their aspirations for their children? What do they worry about? And how can you mop up those worries as quickly as possible, and make sure that you trust each other? So that's one thing that I would do, because, obviously levels of resilience will vary between pupils, but at the point of entry, you have an amazing opportunity to set your store, and to also establish a vision for a school that really, really believes in parent partnership. And parent partnership is not about parental interference. It's about acknowledging the importance of parents in children's lives and outcomes. And I think it's very powerful for a school leader to recognize, not to say we're keeping you at arm's length, but to say you are that child's first teacher, and we're here to supplement the great work that you've done at home, and we're going to work together. And what we don't know, we will find out together. And I think that's a very safe space to be in the current climate, because life is very complex. Teachers are not social workers, they're not psychiatrists, they're not clinical psychologists, they're not eating disorder experts. We need to work with parents collaboratively on everything, and that includes learning. So, in terms of reducing children's anxiety ahead of academic tests, exams, all of that is possible with parent partnership. And upskilling parents, which of course I'm passionate about, so that they can actually appreciate what the school is doing, and that they can use approaches at home that match that. Because with that alignment, you're really going to see the magic happening. So there is great benefit in parent partnership because it actually increases the appreciation of what the school is doing. Parents always appreciate honesty, authenticity, and quite frankly, value for money. What is it that I'm getting from this environment that I couldn't get anywhere else? And that is being heard, being listened to, being valued, being able to shape the culture of the school through that contribution and through those supportive relationships.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for joining us on our podcast today and for your insightful and valuable contributions to this episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you provided a great deal for our listeners and enabled this episode to give lots of insight and support. It really has shined a light on how important it is for our parents and schools to work together in partnership. And I do love that term of partnership to support the mental health and well-being of the children and young people in their care. So it's been really good. To our audience, thank you once again for tuning in to this episode of the ISA podcast series on mental health and well-being. If you found this episode helpful, do look back over the series, make sure you subscribe for future episodes, and we'll continue exploring crucial topics in education. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll be back soon with more insights and inspiration. Until next time.
You've been listening to Independently Speaking, the podcast of the Independent Schools Association. For more information about ISA and the schools we support, please visit isaschools.org.uk.